If you're like me, you're always looking for ways to make your Unreal Engine renders look more believable. Digital renders tend to look a bit plasticky and a bit too perfect, and there's often something that feels like it's missing, even if we can't quite put our finger on what it is. I've tried many things to combat this issue, and I've talked about many of those things in previous videos on this channel, but there's a key one that I want to discuss today which can really take your renders to the next level in terms of realism and believability, and that is film emulation. Film emulation is the process of taking a digital image and processing it so that it mimics the characteristics of film. Some of these characteristics include contrast level, color density, bloom, halation, grain, gate weave, and film breadth. These are all imperfections that have to do with the physical processes performed when shooting on film, and many consider them to be what add that magical quality to many of the movies that we know and love. The beauty of film is that it's actually a physical, chemical process taking place and capturing an analog representation of the physical world. This differs from digital capture because digital capture is not a continuous representation of the world, but rather an approximation which is made up of individual data points like the pixels that make up an image or the exposure levels of those pixels which define their brightness. There is a hard stop, finite range of data which is captured, and if insufficient data is captured, then there's simply nothing you can do to recover it, nor does it provide any flexibility beyond the range of what was captured. This is what happens when your audio clips or when your highlights clip. Your highlights become a flat, single color with a single brightness, and any data beyond that cannot be recovered because it's simply not there. So when it comes to film is an analog capture method, meaning it's captured from a signal that is generated by a continuously variable physical source. This results in a continuous image rather than one made up of individual data points, meaning it's not made up of pixels, and it provides much more flexibility when it comes to preserving information, especially in the highlights after the film is exposed initially. So film consists of tiny silver particles which are embedded in the film stock. When these particles are exposed to light, which is captured through the camera lens and essentially funneled onto the piece of film, they undergo a chemical process which imprints the captured light onto the film. The film negative, which is what is the result of this process, is then processed, inverted, and printed onto a final positive for display. This physical process is where some of the aforementioned imperfections and that magical quality associated with film comes from. So what I really want to dive into and explore in this video is how can we recreate these imperfections and qualities which come from the physical process of film capture, and then apply them to our renders, which are captured digitally. One of the best solutions I found for this is through a plugin called Dehancer. Dehancer is a film emulation plugin available for DaVinci Resolve, Adobe After Effects and Premiere Pro, as well as Final Cut Pro, and its aim is to make the film emulation process streamlined and easy, and it does just that. Now, before we get too far into the video, I want to point out that Dehancer did contact me about making this video. They offered me a free license for the plugin as well as a 10% discount code for all of you to use, which would also give me a 10% commission when you guys use it. So if you do purchase Dehancer, it would be awesome if you guys would use my code UnrealColor to get 10% off your purchase, and also to help out the channel so that I can keep making videos like this for you guys. So I'll leave that coupon code in the description below, and it would be awesome if you guys would use that. So Dehancer asked me for an honest review of their plugin and did not mandate any particular opinion on it. So the opinions that I'm expressing here are completely my own, and they're 100% honest. I also want to point out that a couple of months ago, I was researching film emulation pretty heavily, and I actually had decided that I wanted to purchase Dehancer before ever being contacted by them. I didn't do so at the time because at the time I wasn't doing enough color grading to justify the purchase. So this was a happy coincidence that they reached out to me, and I want to point out that I very much stand behind their product, enough so that I was actually planning to purchase it on my own anyway. Now, I also want to say that while this video is largely dedicated to reviewing and providing insight into the Dehancer plugin specifically, the point of this video is ultimately to give some insight into the process of film emulation. what it's about, and how to accomplish it. While Dehancer makes it incredibly easy and fast to achieve impressively accurate film emulation results, it's possible to achieve this look using other methods, which I would be more than happy to make more videos about in the future if that's something that interests you guys. These methods simply take longer and lack the advanced algorithms and processing that Dehancer offers, which provide those more accurate and realistic film emulation results. But the important takeaway from this video is that film emulation is an excellent way to bring life and realism to your CGI renders, as well as any live action footage that you've shot, when it's done right. So I also want to take a second and say that if you guys haven't already, you should definitely go over to my website, boundless-resource.com, and check out the Unreal Engine for Filmmakers course. It's going to be a one-stop guide to everything that you need to know about filmmaking in Unreal Engine, as well as visual effects, game cinematics design, and anything else that you can imagine. We also have an awesome plugin that was developed by our team, which is called Path Tracer Pro, and it's going to really streamline the lighting and rendering aspects of using Unreal as a filmmaking tool. So I highly recommend you check that out. We're also coming out with a new version of that plugin, which is going to have 10 times more features and all kinds of new stuff I can't wait to share with you guys. So head on over to boundlessresource.com and check that out. I'll leave a link in the description.
Alright guys, so here we are inside of DaVinci Resolve. I have an EXR sequence imported that I've rendered out of Unreal Engine using OpenColor.io and the ACES pipeline. What we want to do here is get our project set up so that we can actually utilize ACES and the format that we rendered this in. So I go over this in the Unreal Engine for Filmmakers course. It's a really good workflow, especially for CGI renders that are coming out of Unreal. Using OpenColor.io in combination with the ACES color profiles is a really good way to ensure that you have continuity with your color space and your working color spaces across multiple programs like DaVinci Resolve, Unreal Engine, Adobe After Effects, Nuke, and pretty much any program that you want to use. Most programs are going to have this capability. So all I've done is I've exported my footage here from Unreal Engine using an OpenColor.io config file and the ACES 1.2 color settings. So what I want to do here is to interpret this footage properly, I want to go into File and then into Project Settings. And in my color management tab, so it might open in your master settings where you can set up your resolution and frame rate and stuff. I rendered my sequences in 24 frames per second. If I go into color management, we have our color science right here, and you might be in DaVinci YRGB. I'm going to actually go down here and choose ACES CCT. For my ACES version, for this particular instance, I used ACES 1.2. You can choose whichever version you used, depending on how you rendered your footage and what config file you used. I used ACES 1.2. When it comes to the ACES input transform, we're going to leave this as no input transform. And for our ACES output transform, we're going to transform this to Rec 709, which is a common color space that is typically used for display purposes. We should be able to leave the other settings the same. I'm going to hit cancel, but for you, you would want to hit save. So if you look at our footage, it's looking a little bit pink and a little bit saturated in a weird way. And that's because we haven't actually transformed the color space properly yet. What we want to do is click on our footage and right click on our footage, go to ACES Input Transform, go down to Color Space Conversion. We're going to go down to ACES CG CSC, which stands for Color Space Conversion. And that is the color profile that I used in my OpenColor.io config file rendering out of Unreal. So you're going to want to make sure that you match that up here with what you used in Unreal. So you're going to see that's going to slightly modify the look of our footage, and now it's looking like a proper logarithmic format for color grading. So we're going to right click and create a new timeline using the selected clip. I already have a timeline created here, so if you look at this other clip, this is going to be kind of what we're creating, the look that we're going to be creating using Dehancer. So this is our raw footage. I'm just going to show you the basic setup that you're going to want to do for using Dehancer. So I'll hit Alt S a couple of times on the keyboard and I'll show you the typical node tree setup that we're going to use for Dehancer. So the first one, I'll hit R on the keyboard, type in primaries. That's going to be where we're going to do the primary color grading on our image. The second node here is where we would want to use a color space transform effect. So if I type in color space transform, and I can apply that right there, and you can change your input color spaces and gamma as well, and you can transform that to whatever you choose. So I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to actually get rid of that node. We already did our color space conversion over here, so we don't need the color space transform node. For the next node, we're going to hit R on the keyboard and call it Dehancer. So that's going to be our Dehancer plugin node, where we can apply the OFX plugin. And our last node here is where we're going to add any sort of sharpening or post effects that we want to do. They recommend adding sharpening after Dehancer. In our case, we're going to get rid of that node because we're not going to be doing any sharpening. The only other thing that we're going to possibly do is add denoising, and we would want to do that before the primaries node over here. So I'm not going to be doing that. You can see this image is not super noisy. It has a little bit because I rendered using the path tracer, but I don't mind that. It gives it a naturalistic feel. So at this point, I don't really need to make any modifications to the primaries for my footage. The only thing that you might want to do is, this is looking a little bit pink, and that was intentional, for the lighting. But if you want to, you can always, make adjustments to the green channel and also shift the color temperature a little bit to cool it off, and that's going to neutralize those colors a little bit. So what I'm going to show you now is how to use Dehancer to not only apply a look to your footage and add that nice contrast and saturation, but also how to achieve the film look by adding imperfections like halation and grain and things like that. Okay, so we've applied our Dehancer node, and what we want to do here for our input is we have our source, so we can set this to Rec 709 if we have a Rec 709 input, or we can choose any of these other settings. So if we used a color space transform, for example, and we're outputting a Cineon film log look, we can choose Cineon film log, and Dehancer will appropriately interpret the colors coming in so that it conforms to the Cineon film log input. You can also choose a camera. If you've shot this on a real camera, for example, they have a lot of options. They actually have an iPhone setting, which is really cool actually. If you maybe shot iPhone footage on a trip or something like that, you can use Dehancer and properly transform the color space so that you can really dial in that film look even on iPhone footage. They have Arri, Blackmagic Design, pretty much all the big camera companies, or really all the camera companies. They have Red here, and they have lots of different camera profiles and settings as well. So for Sony, for example, you can choose the FX3, and then you have the S-Log formats, which you can choose from there. In this case, we are using ACES CCT, which matches up here with our project settings. We used ACES CCT right there. So the way that you can check to see if you have the proper input source is by going down here and just disabling all of the sections that Dehancer applies. So disable the film look, disable any of the other options here that Dehancer applies for us, like film grain. And then if you uncheck Dehancer and then turn the node back on, you can see that it looks exactly the same whether or not Dehancer is applied to the footage. So that's how you know that your source input is set up properly. So you can see we have a couple of settings here. These are just common, typical primary adjustment settings. So this is going to be pretty much the same as applying these settings in our primaries node using DaVinci Resolve's tools. So I don't really typically use these settings. The first thing that I want to do is show you the film stocks here that you can choose from. I believe there are 62 film stocks that you can choose from. And if we enable this, you can see it's going to apply a look right off the bat. You have a lot of different motion picture film stocks as well as still photography film stocks. So there's a lot of really good stuff in here. I tend to like this Kodak Vision 3 250D. I also like the 50D and the 500T. The T stocks are the tungsten versions. So if you look, the T that's behind the number stands for tungsten, and the D stands for daylight. So that's why you're getting a more properly balanced looking image when you're using the daylight, because this shot was balanced for daylight. So the Vision 3 250D is one of my favorites. I also tend to like this Fujichrome Velvia 100. It kind of gives a little more blue saturation in the shadows. Also kind of makes those colors pop a little bit more. As you can see, like in the sky, we're getting some interesting looking saturation to those blues. And another tip is that if you choose a film stock and then you hover over the drop down box, if you just scroll using the middle mouse button, it's actually going to cycle through those film stocks so you can easily and quickly cycle through and see which one you tend to like. You also have a push-pull option. This is essentially mimicking the look if you underexposed your footage when you were shooting it, and then you shift it to be properly exposed in the processing phase. So if you underexposed it and then brought up the level of exposure in the processing phase, that's the same thing as moving the slider to the right, so that's going to reduce the contrast and make those black areas look a little more milky. If you go the other way, you overexpose your image and then you bring it down to be properly exposed in the processing phase. It's like moving the slider to the left, and that's going to actually add a little bit of contrast back into it, and it's kind of going to desaturate those dark areas a little bit, which can be a nice look. I'm going to leave this in the middle for now, and I'm going to choose the Velvia 100 film stock. So that's the film stocks, and you guys can play around with those. The next thing that I want to do is go right down to our print section. So I'm going to enable that, and essentially what this print section is doing is it's going to perform a similar operation as the LUTs that you would normally apply in digital color grading. So LUTs stands for lookup table, and it's essentially going to apply a look to your footage and add a little bit of contrast and things like that. So in the physical process of film, what you do is you capture a negative, which is captured on the film stock, which is used to actually shoot your footage. But then once you've processed the film, you actually have to print it onto a final positive. Here we have a couple of different options, and this is where some of that contrast is added in based on the stock that you're printing to. So in this case, we have two main ones, the Fujifilm 3513 print film, and we also have the Kodak 2383, which is a very common one. And this is going to be typically what you're going to see in most motion pictures that are shot on film. And we also have this Kodak Endura glossy paper. So I'm typically going to use the Kodak 2383, but if you like the look of the Fujifilm or whatever, you can always do that. Whereas with the Cineon film log, that's going to actually output a film log look so that you can apply your own LUT or whatever you want after the dehancer node. So I'll just hit Alt S on the keyboard and then I'll apply that look right here. I'm going to get rid of that node, and in our case we're going to use this Kodak 2383 print film. We also have some options down here. So we have our target white and exposure as well as tonal contrast. So if you adjust that target white, you're going to see what that's going to do. It's essentially going to bring down the highlights or bring them up. It's kind of adding a little bit of contrast by adjusting those highlights. We also have our exposure, so if you bring this up, you're going to see that it's going to give a similar organic look to the exposure adjustment, whereas if we bring it down, it's going to kind of give this crushed look, which is a little more accurate to what film looks like when you modify its exposure in the print process. So this is where you're probably going to want to make adjustments to your exposure rather than up here or in your primaries, and this is what I recommend because it's going to give a more accurate and more organic look to your footage based on the film process. So I'm going to leave my exposure as it is. We can also modify our tonal contrast. So if we want to fit our image within a certain smaller IRE range, we can decrease the tonal contrast, and that's going to bring up those shadows and also bring down those highlights slightly, as you can see from the scopes right here. And that is a look that is common for film. If you look at movies that are shot on film, if you look at their scopes, they're often fit between smaller IRE ranges. So you can adjust that right here, and if you increase it, you're going to increase your contrast significantly until it doesn't look good. But I'm going to leave my tonal contrast as it is right now, and we can always modify that later. Here is a very important setting, which is the color density. It actually makes adjustments to the density of the colors in our image. And this appears to us as saturation, but it's more of a nuanced type of saturation. It doesn't just apply saturation across the board. So if you take a look at the red colors in his armor and in his face, if we decrease the color density, the sky in the background is not really being affected, but the red on his armor is actually becoming much more saturated and it's being affected more significantly. So this is what we often see on film, where those reds are way more saturated and those blues can sometimes start to pop a little bit. But you can see we're getting a really nice looking red color here in this tank on his back, which, you know, if we bring this down, is kind of going away. And this is really hard to replicate just using the saturation tools in the editor. So Dehancer is really good for achieving that really nice saturated film look without taking it overboard or globally modifying saturation. So if you see this saturation slider, we also have this kind of global saturation slider. So I'm going to leave that as is. And the last thing that we have in this section is the analog range limiter. So if I turn that on and off, you can see what that's doing. It's just shrinking those IRE ranges to a more compressed range. So we're getting more of that filmic look with the raised shadows and the more subdued highlights. And you can also always mess with the tonal contrast if you want to tweak that a little bit. So something like that is looking pretty good. So you can see that we have a really nice image already, and we could just stop right here and be in pretty good shape. But I want to take it a step further and show you guys more of the tools that can be found inside of Dehancer. So the next thing that I'm going to go over here is the color head settings, and these are essentially the color grading tool set that are available in Dehancer. Make sure that it's enabled first, and then we can kind of shift our hues to whatever we choose. So I'm going to slightly put this towards yellow, and then we're going to shift it a little bit towards green, and then we're going to shift it slightly towards cyan. And you can see that if we disable that and re-enable it, you're going to see it's going to give it just that slight greenish bluish tone, which I kind of like. You can also adjust the shadow tones. You can make it a little more blue, a little more yellow, whatever you want. So I'm going to just slightly push this towards yellow. You can adjust your midtones and also your highlights as well. So you have a lot of control there. The next thing that we want to do is start applying some of these imperfections to our footage. So we have our film grain, our halation, our bloom, film damage, film breath, and gate weave. So I'm going to go over each of these. For our film grain, if we check that on, you can see that it's adding some really nice grain right here. What's nice about Dehancer is that it's not just adding a grain overlay, it's actually using an algorithm to basically determine areas that it will apply grain with more strength and areas that are going to have less grain based on the exposure value and look of your image. So that's how it works when you're shooting on actual film, because with actual film, the grains in the film stock are exposed to different amounts of light, and that's going to result in the visible grain that shows up in your footage, and that's going to happen at different amounts based on the exposure and the amount of light that is actually being exposed onto that film stock. So we have some presets here. We have 8mm, and that's going to be a lot more pronounced, so it's going to be a little bigger and a little thicker. And we also have 16mm and then 35mm. That's going to shrink it down and be less pronounced. And then we have all the way up to 65mm, which is going to be pretty subdued. And if we go down to ISO 50, it's going to be almost non-existent. However, it is still definitely there. So these are going to be some good options. I like to go with the 35mm ISO 250. And you can also go in, if you want, and customize those settings to whatever you want. So you have a lot of control. And now if we go down to the halation, so I'll turn it on first so you can see what it does. And if I go to this area in my footage, if I disable the halation, you'll see what it does. So it essentially adds this kind of orange halo around anywhere in your footage that is an area of strong contrast between a bright area and a darker area. So in this case, we have the bright sky, which is one of the brightest spots in our image, and then we have our character, which is a pretty dark area, and that's going to cause this little halo effect. And essentially there's a physical reason why this happens when you're shooting on actual film. It actually has to do with the light bouncing off of the red coating inside of the camera when you're shooting, and it results in this kind of red bleeding glow around the edge of high contrast areas in your frame. So you'll see it in a few places here, but especially around this guy here. So if I increase how pronounced it is, if I go with the Super 8, no remjet, you're going to see that it's very pronounced, very obvious.
So that's going to show you kind of what it's doing, and honestly, even with that excessive amount, it's still looking pretty good here, and the enhancer does a good job of making it look nice and natural and realistic. If we go with Super 8, and it's going to really mimic something that's shot on Super 8 film. I like to keep this pretty subdued with the 35mm Super 35 preset, and that's going to keep it pretty minimal. And if you see, if I turn it off and back on, it's pretty subtle. If you want to make it even more subtle, you can go up to the 70mm preset, 65mm preset. You want to keep these imperfections very minimal. You don't want to overdo this unless you're trying to replicate the look of 8mm film. It's something that I see a lot of people overdoing, especially people that are new to color grading and that are just getting started with film emulation. You're going to see some crazy film grain and halation, and it's not going to be a super realistic or believable look. So you're going to want to keep these a little more subdued and not overdo it. So you can also customize the halation settings as well. So I'm going to leave it on the 35mm preset, and the next thing that we have is bloom, and that's going to give a really nice look of glowing kind of softness and bloom to those highlights in our image. And if we take this down to the 8mm preset, if I disable it and then re-enable it, you're going to see that it's just going to add this kind of nice glow to our image, and we can also customize that as well. So I'm going to reset that and leave it at this 35mm preset, but it's going to give us this really nice look to those highlights and a nice softness to our image. And if you want to go for a more Lord of the Rings type look, it tends to be kind of glowing, especially in the elven regions. If we grab our impact here and we just pull that up, you're going to see that that's going to significantly increase the amount of bloom, and you can see that it's going to give you this kind of glowing, kind of magical quality to your footage. So it applies it in a really naturalistic way, which I really like. So I'm going to leave that at the 35mm preset once again. So the film damage is going to be exactly what it sounds like. It's those scratch marks and imperfections that you see, especially on old film. And it applies it in a really nice way. It's more integrated into the image, and it does a really good job. And it, if you're going for that look, can give you a really nice looking emulation. And we can, go with the more subtle 35mm or 65mm presets. I'm going to personally leave this unchecked because I'm not going for a 100% fully accurate film emulation. I'm going for a certain look. The film breadth is another option for really going the distance on your film emulation. So if I turn this to the 8mm, you're going to see what that does. It slightly modifies the exposure and color values in your image and the hues from frame to frame, and that's going to just come from the lack of consistency in the processing and capture of those film frames and that slight variation. For me, once again, I'm going to disable this. It's not really something that I want to do in this particular shot. So the last thing that I'm going to do here is go over the gate weave, and you can see that it's going to, if I go down to the 8mm preset, it's going to apply some jitter to the frame, and it's just going to have that slight movement that comes from the film shifting around in the sprockets, and it's going to be a kind of natural look for film. And if you've ever watched like an older movie that has a title sequence or a title card where the title kind of shifts and jitters around a little bit, that's where that's coming from. It's coming from this gate weave. So if you want to have that very slight effect, go for it. I find that especially for static shots, this can be a really nice subtle effect. Sometimes I add this with actual slight jitter to the camera movement, as I go over in the Unreal Engine for Filmmakers course, where I add some slight camera shake, which gives it a natural look, like it was shot, using real stabilization equipment. But with the gate weave, it's a really nice way to add that slight variation and shifting in the positioning of the frame to get that natural film look. So I'm going to leave that enabled. I kind of like that. There's also vignetting that you can do. It's pretty self-explanatory. And we also have our film compression. So this is the last thing that I'll go over. So you can see that that's just compressing once again inside a smaller IRE range. You can change the impact of it. We also have our white point, which if we bring that up, it's going to bring that white point down. And if we bring it down, it's going to bring it up. And we have our tonal range, which is going to bring down that contrast level in a naturalistic way. So you can see we're still preserving that color density, which is awesome, but we're just reducing that contrast. So it's a very natural way of doing it, because if you just decrease the contrast, you're also going to lose that really nice color density, Whereas if you modify the tonal range here, you get to keep that nice color density while modifying the contrast. So there's some pretty nice, useful tools here. We also have another color density setting here, which we can modify, and you're gonna see that's just gonna kind of pull in a little more color in the clouds and give us a little more density there. So I'm just gonna reset this and go somewhere in that range for this effect. There's a lot of settings, so don't let that overwhelm you, but just know that with a few clicks in here, you can get a really nice look out of Dehancer. So Dehancer also allowed me to sample the Premiere Pro plugin, as well as the DaVinci Resolve plugin, which we've just gone over, and I have to say that both are incredibly useful. So at this point, for myself, I like to edit with Premiere, since that's what I've used throughout my career and that's what I grew up using. And that makes it incredibly convenient to be able to color grade my footage directly inside of Premiere. I prefer to color grade in DaVinci Resolve, which is worth the round trip between the two programs in many cases. But for YouTube tutorials and quick videos that are primarily informational, having a solid color grading and film emulation tool directly inside of Premiere is awesome. Now, if I'm giving recommendations, I would say that it depends on what type of work you're doing and which system you prefer, but ultimately I would say go with the Resolve plugin. I feel that Premiere and most Adobe products are simply being outdone by Blackmagic and some other companies, and quite frankly, you get way more bang for your buck with Resolve. So as an investment for the future, I think that the Resolve plugin is a far better future-proof investment because Blackmagic is just a better company in my opinion with better products. The last thing that I want to point out is that Dehancer now has an iPhone app, which allows you to perform impressive film emulation on footage or images without ever leaving your phone. And it has compatibility with a variety of formats, including JPEG, RAW formats, TIFF, and PNG, so you can work with a variety of sources. So if you're capturing footage or images on your iPhone or even with an external source, or if you're just not ready to make the investment for the full version of Dehancer Pro, the iPhone app is a great way to see what it's all about. So once again, if you do purchase Dehancer, it would be awesome if you guys would use my code UnrealColor to get 10% off your purchase and also help out the channel so I can keep making videos like this for you guys. And if you want to learn more about Unreal Engine, visual effects, and filmmaking, I highly recommend you check out the Unreal Engine for Filmmakers course. It gives you everything you need to go from complete beginner to industry professional quickly and efficiently. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and please comment any ideas that you have for future videos, courses you guys would like to see, or plugins that you want to see in Unreal Engine. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.